Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you all for joining us today. We're excited you're here. Just a few quick things before we get started. First of all, I want to thank you all for coming. My name is Matt Gagel. I am the Director of Programs at Montgomery History. Throughout the program, if you have any questions, please use the Q&A function. I will address any technical issues, or if there is any issues related to any problems with Zoom, you can send those via the Q&A function. We also will be taking questions for this program, but we will be addressing those at the end. So please send those and we will get to them, as many of them as we can. We probably won't be able to get to all of them, but we'll do our best. Second of all, I'd like to let everyone know about next week's program, which is the Path to Leadership, the next chapter, as you can see on the screen right there, which is next Tuesday, August 18th at 2 p.m. And that will be with researcher Claire McDonald, who has done a couple other projects for us in the past, but we will be launching part 2 of our women's history related to the suffrage movement, both pre and post suffrage. And we'll be launching that in conjunction with the talk next Tuesday. You can register for that on our website. And then the other thing I'd like to point out is that you can also visit our website, montgomeryhistory.org, and do a couple different things while you're there. First of all, as I've pointed out in previous conversations, I do want to thank everyone who has previously made donations and to help us continue to offer these programs, which we would not be able to do without you. So again, thank you so much to everyone who has done that. We are excited to be able to continue to offer history in many varied ways. And if you'd like to can make a donation, you can again visit our website, montgomeryhistory.org, and then at the very top you can click on the orange Donate Now button. And you can make a donation there, either a one-time donation or a monthly recurring donation. And as well as if you have any questions regarding membership, you can certainly reach out to me or send an email to info@montgomeryhistory.org, and we can get that sorted for you. Lastly, on our website, if you go to montgomeryhistory.org/MHconnected, you will find our online hub where we will have recordings of previous talks and information regarding upcoming talks, as well as access to our COVID-19 archive and other online resources, including online exhibits. Okay, that's all I've got. I do see that a question that came through that I'll go ahead and address now is, will there be a handout for this presentation? And if so, will we be able to access them via the internet? Jim, did you have a handout? I don't believe you did.
I don't have a handout, but they can go to my website, jameshjohnston.com, and go to publications, and you'll see a copy of the article I wrote for the White House Historical Magazine.
Okay, all right, so there we go. It's on Jim's website. James, you said it's H. Johnston?
Right.
James H. Johnston, and that's Johnston with a T, .com.
Right.
And
under publications on the left,
yep.
you'll see.
There it is. Okay. All right. With that, I'll stop talking because you didn't come and no one came here to listen to me. We're here to talk, listen to Jim. So Jim, whenever you're ready, you should be able to go ahead and share your screen. And we're excited for this presentation.
Thank you very much. We'll go with this. This was as I just indicated, this was an article I wrote for the White House Historical Magazine several years ago. And I'd done some research and I met the Washingtons, and I'll get into all of that. But let me begin with the background on Lincoln and Washington. They were not contemporaries, obviously. Lincoln was born 10 years after Washington died. Their presidential terms were 64 years apart. But Lincoln adored George Washington. Washington had 3 brothers, 1 sister, and a half brother, and 2 half brothers. And so he had no children, but he did have all these collateral descendants, and it is them that I will be talking about. In fact, his 3 full brothers all lived in Charlestown, West Virginia. It's now West Virginia. It was Virginia then. And it was named after his brother, Charles. So Charlestown, West Virginia was named after Charles Washington, the brother of George Washington. In my research, I ran into Washingtons, and I'm going to show you some of them. These are Washingtons that live in West Virginia. Some you may look a little bit like George. On the left was Betsy Wells. She is descended through the Alexander line, and I just want you to, you'll hear that word later. In the center there is Walter Washington. I was pretty embarrassed when I first met them because Betsy and Walter were giving a talk and I was giving a talk at the same place. And I was so amazed with Walter Washington to know that a Washington was, I didn't realize there were Washingtons who were alive. I didn't realize there were all these descendants. And I walked up to him after the talk and I said, foolishly, I want to thank you so much for what your ancestor did for our country. And I was terribly embarrassed afterwards. It was like a little boy, but this guy looks like George Washington. Next to him is John Augustine Washington, like the 7th. He's passed away recently. He was the family genealogist, historian. And he told me there were an estimated 64,000 Washingtons. So it's not unusual to run into a Washington. And the man at the bottom is his son. As I said, Abraham Lincoln idolized George Washington. And he said that the first book he read, one of the first books he read as a boy, was a biography of Washington by a man named Parson Weems. And it was sort of a fictionalized version, it was cherry tree, cutting down the cherry tree and all that kind of stuff with some real facts mixed in. But Lincoln that was, the book that made the greatest impression because he was a boy. And to show you how much that meant to him, when he was elected president and left Springfield, Illinois, the train took him through Trenton, New Jersey. And he gave a talk to the New Jersey legislature. And here's what he said, and they're in Trenton, and here's what he said. May I be pardoned if upon this occasion I mention that away back in my childhood, the earliest days of my being able to read, I got a hold of a small book, such a one as few of the younger members of the legislature have ever seen, Weems' Life of Washington. I remember all the accounts they're given of the battlefields and struggles for the liberty of the country, and none fixed themselves upon my imagination so deeply as the struggle here at Trenton, New Jersey, the crossing of the river, the Delaware, the contest with the Hessians, the great hardships endured at that time, all fixed themselves on my memory more than any single event. And you all know, for you have all been boys, how these early impressions last longer than any others. But that's 1861 when he's elected president. We're going to go back now to 1848 when Lincoln is a congressman from Illinois. And even at that point, he adored George Washington. And so in February of 1848, Lincoln and Stephen Douglas, among others, were named to be on the committee for the Birth Night Ball. I know it sounds strange, but it's Washington's birth and the Birth Night Ball. And in fact, these celebrations had been held ever since even before George Washington passed away. I remember seeing some newspaper ad or something or announcement about the Birth Night Ball in Alexandria in 1890s or so. 1790s. So Birth Night Ball, we don't have that word around anymore, but in those days it was a big deal. And the Birth Night Ball, which would be held on February 22nd, 1848, was to raise funds to build the Washington Monument. So Lincoln is a member of that committee. The co-chairs were Dolly Madison, James Madison's widow, Betsy Hamilton, Alexander Hamilton's widow, and Louisa Adams, who was John Quincy Adams's wife. John Quincy was the son of John Adams. So Lincoln is on this committee with some founders, Dolly Madison and Betsy Hamilton, people who, the widows of the men who founded the country. And so he's quite impressed with, as a new congressman, he's pretty impressed with all of this. Well, before they could hold the birthnight ball on February 22nd, 1848, John Quincy Adams had a stroke. He'd been president and then he was on the House of Representatives. He had a stroke on the floor of the House of Representatives and died a few days later. So Lincoln got appointed to the John Quincy Adams Funeral Committee for the House. And at the end of that week, the end of the week of February 22nd, 1848, Lincoln went out to Mount Vernon for the first time. And this was still in private hands then. So tourists would flock there, but you couldn't go into the house unless you knew the Washingtons who were living there. And so Lincoln probably didn't go into the house. Although we think of Lincoln as very famous now, he wasn't particularly famous in 1848. So he walked around the grounds and, among other things, he picked up this limb and had it made into a cane. This is the most strangest object I've ever seen, but it's apparently Lincoln did take this back and sort of smoothed it out and made it to a cane. And even odder, it is now in the museum at the University of Kansas. So how it made it from Mount Vernon to Kansas is a good question that I don't know the answer to. But Lincoln went back that night from Mount Vernon, and he was rooming with several other people on Capitol Hill, and they said he kept them up the whole night, regaling them with stories about Mount Vernon. So he was enormously impressed. And, it's just absolutely clear that Lincoln idolized George Washington and was a Washington fan. The day Lincoln went there, this man was the owner, or actually the living at Mount Vernon. His name is John Augustine Washington III. And I will say, the Washingtons recycled names generation after generation after generation. So don't be surprised that you're going to hear lots of John Augustine Washingtons and other names like that. Moreover, I was warned that they always used the full name, John Augustine Washington, to help with the confusion. So I will often refer to these people by three names. So John Augustine Washington was living at Mount Vernon. He was not there at the time of Lincoln's visit. And I know because I checked. I went out to Mount Vernon and found letters of him written from Charlestown, West Virginia that day. But his wife, Nellie, was there. And again, Lincoln wouldn't have met her unless something exceptional happened. And there's no evidence they met. Well, then that's 1848. Now I'm going to move you up very quickly. No, I guess I'm going to move you up now to 1859. By 1859, John Augustine Washington was owner of the house, and the Ladies Association, Mount Vernon Ladies Association, wanted him to sell it. So on February 22nd, Washington's birthday, 1859, this man signed the papers to sell Mount Vernon to the Ladies Association, who have owned it ever since. Okay, we're still in 1859. I'll move ahead to October 15th, 1859. I'm sorry, this is John Augustine Washington moved to this house. It's called Waveland in Northern Virginia, and I think probably Prince William County. And I like this picture because one of my first books was on the Loughboroughs of Montgomery County, and some of them owned that house. Some of their ancestors owned that house. And then I think they sold it to John Augustine Washington, or maybe it was the other way around, but it's a pretty big house out there. But now going to October 15th, 1859, John Brown. That's the day he led his 23 men into Harper's Ferry, West Virginia. It was Virginia then, West Virginia now. He led them into Harper's Ferry, and he seized the arsenal there, federal arsenal. And so he seizes it with these men, and he calls for a slave revolt, in Virginia. Terrible stuff. Well, John Brown was afraid he wouldn't get newspaper coverage with that maybe, calling for a slave revolt and seizing a federal arsenal, none of the press would cover it. So he decided that he needed more important people in Harper's Ferry with him. So he sent his men out there's Harper's Ferry, and he sent his men out here to a house called Bel Air in Halltown, West Virginia. And in this house was Lewis William Washington. He was a grandson of one of Washington's half brothers, and he was living there at the time. And so John Brown thought, well, you know, if I take a Washington prisoner, well, then maybe the press will come out and cover me. Even if, you know, in case seizing the federal arsenal and calling for a slave revolt isn't enough, having a Washington as my prisoner will bring the press. And in case that's not enough, because he was still worried it might not be enough, Frederick the Great had given George Washington a sword as a present, and it had ended up in the possession of Lewis William Washington at Bel Air in Halltown. So John Brown said to his men, be sure to get the sword. And so that night, they brought poor old Lewis William Washington and the sword to Harper's Ferry. And John Brown walked around, I guess, with that sword for quite a while. And, you know, they ended up here at the firehouse in Harper's Ferry. This is the old picture of it. And that's where they stayed for a while. And then at this point, I sort of want to have music playing with, you know, like that in old silent movies where you have the chase, because in Charlestown, they learned about all of this. And so they formed a posse, and they're going to go to Harper's Ferry and put down this John Brown and rescue Lewis William Washington. One of the men who went with them was Lewis William Washington's cousin, Dick Washington, Richard Washington. He was the brother of John Augustine Washington you've just seen. And Dick Washington lived here at a place called Blakely in Charlestown, West Virginia. And so he joins the posse. And, you know, now we have the chase music playing as they ride to Harper's Ferry. And when they get there, John Brown and his men are holed up in that firehouse. And so the posse deploys up here and in Harper's Ferry. And that's where the taverns are. So they start drinking a little bit because of various reasons. But then they see one of John Brown's men, who actually was one of the African Americans with John Brown. And so they decide someone is going to shoot him. And Dick Washington is the best squirrel hunter in Jefferson County, Virginia. And so he is chosen as the one to pick off this guard. But he and another man fire at the same time, and they don't know who killed the guard, but it was the, you know, that's the African American who was killed at Harper's Ferry. Well, then the Marines come under the command of Robert E. Lee, and they liberate the firehouse. They break into the firehouse and seize John Brown prisoner. Lewis William Washington is sitting there in the firehouse, pretty bedraggled because it's been a day or two he's been there. And so the saving officer, Lieutenant Green, says to Lewis William Washington, well, sir, are you ready to come out? And Washington says, no, I'm way too grimy, but at least let me put on my kid gloves. So he went out, and he wanted a drink. So the two things he wanted was to put on his gloves and have a drink. John Brown was taken to Charlestown and put on trial. And Lewis William Washington was the principal prosecution witness against him, because he and Washington had talked in that firehouse all the time while they were there. And so Lewis William Washington is the principal witness. John Brown, this is Charlestown. John Brown was hanged on a tree in this yard. It was farmland then. But I want to call your attention also to this yard sign. Hunter was the prosecutor at John Brown's trial, and Samuel Street is named after Samuel Washington, one of George Washington's brothers. So John Brown is hanged here in December. But going back now to the night of October 15th, when John Brown raids Harper's Ferry, I'm going to take you out to Springfield, Illinois, where Abraham Lincoln is practicing law. And he's given up his seat in Congress. He's back practicing law. And he had just been out he just came home that day from riding around the circuits in Illinois for several weeks trying cases. And he gets home, and when he got home, there's a telegram from Henry Ward Beecher. And it says, "Dear Mr. Lincoln, we'd like to have you come to New York to speak at my church." Well, that's October 15th. The next morning, Lincoln would have gotten up. The telegraph was working quite well. So Lincoln undoubtedly read in the newspapers about what had happened in Harper's Ferry, West Virginia. And he surely read that Lewis William Washington had been taken prisoner. So that would have been his first inkling that the Washingtons might be on the other side. But the other significance, this is his request, this is the request to go speak in New York. And that night, the next night of October 16th, he accepts the request that he's going to go to New York to give this speech. Well, it turned out that the speech wasn't at the church in New York, but instead at the Cooper Union Hall, and it's the famous Cooper Union speech. And that speech is given on February 27th, 1860. That's 12 years to the day after Lincoln went out to Mount Vernon. And in that speech, which is about extending slavery to the territories, Lincoln opposes the extension of slavery to new territories. He said Washington was against it, which was true. And one of my favorite lines from that speech is that men cannot unsay what Washington said, that people are lying to say that Washington supported slavery expanding in the United States, that Washington wanted it confined to the South, that he didn't want any more slavery. So that was the speech that launched Lincoln's presidential campaign and made him win the election in 1860. Now, after that, we come back to John Augustine Washington III. I looked at his letters at Mount Vernon. They have some of his letters. And in one of them, he experimented with, he didn't want to have slaves if he could help it. And he experimented with having Irish do the work, some Irish immigrants do the work. And in one of the letters, he says, to somebody, I'm experimenting with having Irish immigrants do the work. And then a few months later, he said, well, that didn't work out. We can't get rid of slaves. So he was in favor of slavery. He certainly depended upon it for his livelihood and to keep things going for him. But with Lincoln's election, and John Augustine Washington III is the patriarch of the family. He's been living at Mount Vernon until he sold it. So everybody looks up to this man as sort of the de facto Washington leader. And when Lincoln got elected, he was very unhappy. And this is what John Augustine Washington's daughter said about it. And they asked him who was elected. And on his answer, Lincoln, his daughter says, young as I was, I heard the death knell of Southern hopes. My father was a states' right Whig of a family of several generations of Whigs, and I felt with him the disruption of the Democratic Party ranks had brought our misfortune upon us. So he just, would not accept Lincoln as president. And therefore, he joined the Confederate Army. He was not a military man. He had not gone to West Point, never served before. But he had friends in high places, including Robert E. Lee. And so when John Augustine Washington went into the Army, he became the aide to Robert E. Lee, and the two men were tent mates. Lee said we would get down on our knees and pray every night. So, and of course, Lee was related to the Washington family anyway, but these two men are good buddies. But at Cheats Mountain, that's like a cheater, but Cheats Mountain, John Augustine Washington got killed. And Lee had to write this letter to both the family and to various people. I found multiple versions of this letter. They explained, he, being Washington, accompanied my son Fitzhugh on a reconnoitering expedition, and I fear was carried too far by his zeal for the cause of the South, which he had so much at heart. Before they were aware, they were fired upon by a concealed party. He was the only person struck and fell dead from his horse. So now the patriarch is dead, John Augustine Washington is dead, and we move to Zion Episcopal Church in Charlestown, West Virginia.
Jim,
Washington gravesite.
Jim,
Yes,
could you move a little closer to your microphone?
I will.
Yeah,
Sorry.
yep, that's all right.
So this is the Washington part of the cemetery at Zion Episcopal Church. There are at least 70 Washingtons buried here. This is John Augustine Washington's tombstone. Now we go back to Lewis William Washington. He didn't fight for the Confederacy, but his son, James Beryl Washington, the man on the left, was an aide to my namesake, Confederate General Johnston, Joseph Eggleston Johnston. And he was captured by the Union at Seven Pines, and here he is with his West Point classmate, George Armstrong Custer. So there's another Washington fighting for the South. We'll move to an in-law, Martha Custis Washington, and her grandsons. These are not Washingtons, but they are in-laws of the Washington. The man on the left is William Orton Williams, and the man on the right is Walter Gipp Peter. Peter was of the Peter family in Georgetown, Tudor Place. He was the son of Robert Peter and Martha Custis Park Washington. These two guys joined the Confederate Army, and they were a little too young and a little too foolish. And so at some point, they decided to ride in, they're in the Confederate Army, they decided to, as a prank, to ride into a Union camp and put on Union uniforms and ride into a Union camp as a prank to see if they could get away with it. So they did. They rode into this Union camp dressed as Union soldiers. For some reason, they figured out that they were Confederates. The general at the time didn't think it was very funny. He had a drumhead court-martial, and he hanged the man within an hour. So there are Martha Custis's grandsons being hanged. This is Cedar Lawn, another Washington house out in Charlestown. At Cedar Lawn, there were 3 Washingtons there who grew up there. There were boys who grew up at this house. One's name was Thornton Washington. He was another aide to Robert E. Lee. You know, the Washingtons would get up with the Lees. There was George Washington. He practiced law in California, but when the Civil War broke out, he joined the Confederate Army. And so those men fought for, I said 3, there were 2. They fought for the Confederate Army in Missouri at the end of the war. I mean, Thornton had been an aide to Lee, and then he moved out to Missouri, and George joined him from California. I wonder what I did there. I think I probably messed up my order there, but these are the men who were, let me go back. That's strange that my notes don't coincide with these were the men that were at Cedar Lawn. Thomas Augustine Washington, Daniel Behringer Washington, and George Washington. I think Thomas went out, was Lee's aide. All right, whatever. Another home out in, I have to key this by the homes in Charlestown. Another home in Charlestown is this one. It's Claymont Court, it's called today. This place is 16,000 square feet. It has 59 rooms. It is twice as big as Mount Vernon. And this was built out there. It's falling apart today, and it's on hard times. They sort of went beyond the state of architecture at the time it was built, and it should never have been this big, but they still try to keep it up. And this was so big. After John Augustine Washington died, several of the other Washington family heads died. And so this became sort of the dormitory for several Washington families. I showed you Blakely earlier, that was Dick Washington's house. It's right off to your left about a mile. And so Dick, the fellow who was the best squirrel hunter in Jefferson County and shot the man in Harper's Ferry, he wanted to go into the Confederacy, and Robert E. Lee said, no, with John Augustine Washington's death, you're the big man in the family. You've got to stay home and take care of this extended Washington family. So Dick Washington lived off to Blakely on the left and looked over this house that had no man as the head of it. It was just several families led by women. At that house were these men: Bushrod Corbin Washington, another George Washington, Thomas Blackburn Alexander, William Fontaine Alexander, James Washington, and Herbert Lee Alexander. As I told you earlier, Betsy Wells is an Alexander. The city of Alexandria is named after the Alexander family that owned big property in Washington's day, and they intermarried with the Washingtons. So these men were all, sort of this giant Washington dormitory, and these men are living there. Bushrod, he fought for the Confederacy and then fought the whole war. And when it was over, he moved to the state of Washington and lived out there until 1909 when he died, and he was buried in the state of Washington. But all the same, there's a monument to him at Zion Episcopal Church in Charlestown, because that's the Washington graveyard. George was killed in action. He's buried in Zion graveyard. Thomas Blackburn Alexander died of wounds in a hospital. William Fontaine Alexander was a doctor. He survived the war. James Washington was with the 12th Virginia, and so he fought in combat. But towards the end of the war, he and his cousin, Herbert Lee Alexander, joined Mosby's Raiders. And so they were fighting with Mosby's Raiders at the end of the war. And that was a guerrilla group, and these people were partisans. James died of typhoid. He was taken prisoner and died of typhoid at Fort McHenry in Baltimore. Herbert was locked up at Fort McHenry, but lasted through the end of the war, but died of tuberculosis a year later. And here's John Mosby. This is the man they were fighting with. Now, what happened then is, this is all sort of Washington lore. And it's, the Washingtons today in Charlestown can tell these stories because they've been handed down through the family and also recorded, written down. So both James and Herbert Alexander were fighting for Mosby, and they tried to blow up a railroad track, but they were caught and, as I said, put in prison. But Phil Sheridan, Union General Phil Sheridan, was assigned to get the Confederates out of the Shenandoah Valley, including Charlestown. And so he was so incensed with these Washingtons that he wrote this order. I want you to send to the home of Mrs. Alexander, where the guerrilla James Washington and Herbert Alexander were captured, and drive off all the stock except one milch cow, and burn every rail on the Claymont, meaning Claymont farm, as punishment for harboring guerrillas. Notify the people in that vicinity that I will destroy every farm and drive off all the stock wherever I find them harboring guerrillas, and put the people outside my line in the direction of Richmond. Report the execution of this order. I was surprised. This so enraged the Washingtons that the ones living today still have a copy of it. And they all know it. It's the famous, and this is an example of how terrible the Union Army was. We moved to Locust Hill, and I'm not sure this house is the Washington house. I just think I went on Google or something and found Locust Hill and thought this looked like the house. But what happened at Locust Hill in Charlestown again was, and this is a story about how brave the women were, apparently. This was a Washington home, and a battle erupted here with the Union and Confederates shooting at each other. And the people, the Washingtons, were still in the house. And so the story goes, one of the women, Jane Charlotte, they all fled, but Jane Charlotte saw that there was a little child left in the house. And so Jane Charlotte ran back with this fire going all over, gunfire going all around, and rescued the child. Well, that's one version. The other version I found was that the child left at the house, was a slave child, and the woman who ran back was a slave woman. So there are two versions, and in my article for the White House History magazine, I sort of compromised and said, well, maybe Jane Charlotte ran back with the slave woman to get the girl, but that also is a Washington story. This is another Washington. I know you're getting tired of Washington houses, maybe. Another Washington house out there, Harewood, and this Harewood, and this is how it looks today. This house is the only house still owned by a Washington, and it's been in the family since it was built in 1783. This was Samuel Washington's house. I'm going to show you him in a minute. Brother of George, and he had married a Payne woman from Philadelphia, and Dolly Madison was Dolly Payne, and so Samuel had married Dolly Madison's sister, except Dolly Madison was Dolly Payne at the time, and so the wedding between James Madison and Dolly Madison was held in this house. And when I was there and given a tour of it, I was told, and this is the room, and it's this room off here to the left as you walk in, big, huge foyer here, and then this big room to the left. And I was in that room, and I was told that this is where Dolly and James Madison were married, and this is the same paint. And it was a pale green, and I said, oh, gee, I thought that colonial colors were bolder than this. They weren't this pale pea green. And I said, no, this is the actual paint. And I said, you mean? And they said, yes, this room has not been painted since the wedding, and I think it was 1793. So that's sort of the history you get from going out there. And here is Samuel Washington. My flash blurred the bottom. But Samuel Washington, and this is another part of the Washington lore, Samuel Washington died of tuberculosis. George's half-brother, Lawrence, who he had worshipped, died of tuberculosis. And George wrote about it oftentimes, saying it's the curse of the family, it's the family disease. Well, they didn't know it at the time. Tuberculosis is a bacteria, and it usually is based in the lungs. So if a father has it and he holds his child, he can well pass the tuberculosis to his child. And so that's the way it was getting passed through the family, not by some curse of God, but just because they didn't know enough about the science. So Samuel contracted tuberculosis and died of it. This is a portrait of his son, George Steptoe Washington. When Samuel died, George sort of became the guardian for George Steptoe, and George Steptoe also died of tuberculosis. And now we come to John Augustine Washington IV. His case of tuberculosis wasn't the lung version, it's the version that infects the bones. And so he suffered bone deformity, skeletal deformities. That's why he looks a little strange. And it also causes what we call hunchback. So he was a somewhat deformed, and couldn't pass an Army physical. So he was doing his best to help the cause anyway. And on one occasion, he went and herded some cattle for the Confederacy. And again, as many Washington stories are, there are two versions. The Washington story is he was completely innocent. He was just driving some cattle down the road, and the Union troops seized him and threw him in prison. The Union version is he was driving cattle to feed a Confederate unit out there and was therefore spying for the Confederacy. And he was thrown into Old Capitol Prison on Capitol Hill, where all Confederate spies were. Well, he had been living in Harewood with his grandmother. His grandmother was Louisa Clemson Washington. And the Clemson is Clemson University, that she was, the Washingtons also intermarried with the Clemson who founded Clemson University. So she's his grandmother. And she's descended from Samuel Washington, who had married, her husband was descended from Samuel Washington, who had married into the Madison family. So she had claims of being both Washington and Madison. And her poor grandson here is in Old Capitol Prison. So she went to Abraham Lincoln to the White House. I think there was a train from Charlestown into Washington in those days. She went to Abraham Lincoln and got an audience with him and explained her story. And she said, my poor grandson with, this deformity is thrown in Old Capitol Prison, and he's a good boy and everything. And so Lincoln penned this letter, note, let the boy John A. Washington remain in Washington and attend school so long as he does not misbehave. A. Lincoln, November 30th, 1864. The family still has this. This is a picture of Abraham Lincoln's signature that is owned by the Washingtons to this day. Now the war ends. This is the grand parade up Pennsylvania Avenue at the end of the war, and I'm going to sort of summarize what happened to all the Washingtons. This is Blakely, Dick Washington, the squirrel hunter that may have killed the man at Harper's Ferry and took care of the family. In one of the letters promoting him, he wanted to go into the Army, and they said he's a good Southerner, and he even buys Confederate war bonds. Well, Blakely, his house burned down in 1864. He rebuilt it pretty much like it is today, but he had all his money in Confederate war bonds, and so he went bankrupt after the Civil War. Claymont, after the war, it fell on hard times. It went bankrupt. The owner went bankrupt in 1871, 6 years after the end of the war, and it was sold to private investors. Today, it's owned by a nonprofit. At Mount Vernon, John Augustine Washington III, who had been killed at Cheats Mountain, nonetheless, he had taken the proceeds from Mount Vernon, from the sale of Mount Vernon, and he had put them in the Burke and Herbert Bank in Alexandria. And Herbert also married into the family, so Herbert is a Washington too. So the money is in that bank in Alexandria. And in 1861, Union forces came in, occupied Alexandria, and they had put the edict out that any officer or anyone who fought for the Confederacy, his property was contraband and could be seized, and therefore John Augustine Washington's money in that bank could be seized. So Mr. Herbert of the Burke and Herbert Bank, being a Washington, took the money out of the bank and took it to his house up in Alexandria. And sure enough, the federal troops came through the bank and looked for the money, anything he owned, didn't find it. Well, then Mr. Herbert feared that they would come to his house. And so he took that money, and it was several $1,000s. I mean, it was quite a considerable money at the time. He took that money. He knew a woman who sold eggs in the city of Washington, D.C., so he gave her the money to hide in her egg basket, and she walked into Washington, D.C. with it, and deposited it in Riggs Bank in Washington, D.C. So that although John Augustine Washington was killed at the start of the war, his family was not poverty-stricken because all his money was in Riggs Bank in Washington. That's just, a block from the White House, and that's where Lincoln had his money. So both John Augustine Washington and Abraham Lincoln had their money in the same bank, and I think they never knew it. This again is the graveyard as I wrap up at Zion Episcopal Church. This is John Augustine Washington's the third monument. Here you can see Washington, Washington, Washington. Here you can see a Madison. So as I said, the families intermarried. Of the Washingtons that I've talked about, 15 of them served in the Confederate Army. 8 of them died in battle, were hanged, or died of disease. And yet, of all of that story I've just told you, if the tourist coming to Washington today would look at the mall and he'd see the Lincoln Memorial just a mile from the Washington Monument, and he would think Lincoln and Washington were so close. That's all I have. Thank you very much. I'll take questions.
Okay, thank you so much, Jim. We'll go ahead and get started with questions. Again, if you have any questions, you can use the Q&A button, and we will get those. If you're watching on Facebook, you can type them in the comments, and I will do my best to get them, excuse me. First of all here, someone asks, was it a controversy in the North that the Washingtons were signing up to defeat the Union and were therefore traitors to their ancestors' cause.
That was never alleged at the time. I think that the general public in the North didn't realize how many Washingtons were fighting for the Confederacy.
Okay. It says the orders that General Sheridan gave for people harboring guerrillas, weren't they considered usual practice for civilians harboring guerrillas? If not, what was?
No, I think they were. It's just that the Washingtons didn't think they were bound by the rules most people, but a lot of Southerners felt that way. They thought they were, at least civilians should be exempt for anything like that. And so it was like when Sherman burned Georgia and the Southerners, the Georgians think that's terrible, but he was saying, we're just waging war. That's war. You started it. And the Washingtons are quite offended by what the Union troops did to them.
Okay. Someone asks, can you discuss what visitation was like to Mount Vernon during the Civil War?
Thank you. I forgot that. It was open, and in fact, Lincoln went out there. He sailed down the Potomac in a boat, but the troops, Union troops, had not gotten all the way down to Mount Vernon. So as they approached the shore, Lincoln very much wanted to go ashore. One of the Union officers with him said, "I don't think it's safe." And so Lincoln did not go ashore. Other people in the boat did go ashore and visited Mount Vernon. But a few months later, Lincoln did go down after the Union took Washington's home down on the the Rappahannock, whatever that Rapidan, his boyhood home. Lincoln did go down there and took a tour of that home with about a platoon of Union soldiers with him. So he did, during the war, he did go visit Mount Vernon, although he didn't get off, and he did go down to Washington's boyhood home.
Okay. Did any Washingtons fight for the Union?
I'm told they did. John Augustine Washington said they did, but I don't, he gave me the name of it, but it was out in Illinois or something. A few, at least one did fight for the Union.
Okay. Someone asks, did any of the Washingtons serve as soldiers for the Confederacy? If so, were they officers?
They were officers. They were not soldiers. They were always officers. As I indicated, two of them were aides to Robert B. Lee, and one of them was an aide to Joseph Johnston.
Someone says, John Augustus Washington bemoaned Lincoln's election per the letter you posted. It indicates he had been a Whig, but weren't the Whigs the party that largely opposed slavery?
No, that was the Democratic Party was the Whigs. But in the 1850s, 1860s, that was viewed as the old Democrat. I mean, that was the Democratic Party. I think, yeah, that was the Democratic Party. Whigs in the American Revolution were the revolutionaries, but those people, I think the Whigs thought of themselves in the 1850s, they were Democrats, and they thought of themselves as the inheritors of the Revolutionary War principles.
Okay. Are there any Lincolns or Washingtons who have written books about their past connections to each other?
The fellow I showed you wrote a book. The fellow I showed you at the very beginning, John Augustine Washington's son, and I think his name is John. He wrote a book about Washington. John Augustine Washington, that I showed you, collaborated with someone to do. There's a big genealogy out on the Washington family, and he collaborated on that book. I don't know about the Lincolns.
Okay. Someone says, do any of the houses in Charleston give tours?
I think one of them is owned by a nonprofit, and I can't remember the one that's I think it was Charles Washington's house. Happy Retreat is the name of it. Happy Retreat is owned by a nonprofit, and in theory, I don't know specifically if they give tours, but it is now in foundation hands. I know they rent it out for events. I don't know if you can get a tour. You can certainly go to the Jefferson County Historical Society in Charlestown, and they can give you lots of information. Most of those places I've shown you are in private hands. Claymont, they may give tours. Again, it's owned by a nonprofit. That's that big house. None of the rest are.
Okay, someone asks, what was the reason for and nature of the connection of the Washington family to West Virginia?
George Washington thought that tobacco was not really a good crop. He didn't think that was a sustainable crop. And he thought that the lands to the west were much better. And as you may know, he bought land in Pennsylvania and I think even some land in Ohio. He had a place up in Maryland, and he had a place out in Charlestown. And he said, this is good, much better to his brothers. He said, because he was the oldest of his three, he was older than his three full brothers. And so he said, you guys ought to settle out here in Charlestown because it's much better land. You can't raise tobacco, but you can raise wheat. The climate's better, it's cooler, all these wonderful things. And that's why they all settled there.
Okay, we'll do just a couple more questions here. What led you to this study of Lincoln and Washington?
Well, I went out to give this talk at Claymont, and I ran into these Washingtons, and I thought, gee, I didn't know there were Washingtons alive. And they started telling me all these stories, and I write, and I thought, this is a really interesting story, and one that nobody's ever covered. So I spent probably a year or so on and off researching this and getting all their lore. Went out to Mount Vernon to look at all these letters and put the story together for the White House History magazine. And then the Montgomery County Historical Society has been so nice as to let me share it with people by Zoom and talks.
Okay, again, we'll just do a couple more questions here because we're getting close to 3 o'clock here. But the sword that was taken by Colonel Lewis Washington during the John Brown raid, where is it, and what do you know about that?
I don't know where it. I know John Brown didn't keep it. It didn't get lost. Somebody's got it. I don't remember who has it. I think somebody, maybe Mount Vernon has it.
Okay. What happened to John A. Washington IV?
I ran an insurance business, I think, in Charlestown.
Okay. How many enslaved people did Washington own? Do you know that answer?
I do not know how many. George owned, I think the number is close to 100, but more than 100. All of these Washingtons owned slaves. When I was at Harewood, they were talking about, they think they know where the slave cemetery is. And were toying with the idea, well, maybe we should dig up those bodies and see if they had tuberculosis, because some of the Washingtons are quite liberal today and so progressive. And so they thought, well, it would be good to get more of the story about the African Americans who were owned by the Washingtons out in Charlestown.
Okay, and we'll just go ahead and do this last question here. Someone says, I understand that George Washington's field tent was stored in Arlington House with relatives, and an enslaved woman saved the tent, which is now in the Museum of the American Revolution in Philadelphia. And the armies clashed there during the Civil War. Did Lincoln know anything about the tent?
Not that I know. I don't know. I can't contribute to that.
Okay, well, all right, we'll go ahead and wrap it up there. Jim, thank you so much. If anybody has any questions, what's the best way for them to get in touch with you there?
You can go to my website, jameshjohnson.com, and I think I got my email address there, so you can shoot me an email.
Okay, and you can always send them to me. My name is Matt Gagel, and you can send it at mgagle, M-G-A-G-L-E, at montgomeryhistory.org, and I will forward those on to Jim there. Again, just want to remind everyone, next week we'll be back here on Tuesday at 2 o'clock to talk about the next chapter of women's suffrage in Montgomery County. With that, again, thanks everyone for joining us, and we will see you all next week. Thanks, Jim.
Thank you. Thank you all for listening.
All right, bye.
Bye.